So red flag, red flag. So keep the delta positive.
Everyone okay?
Stand by. Just looks like instant exit turn 3. Had car on fire, so feedback to you.
Is everyone okay?
I haven't actually seen any more eyes on footage.
Who was it?
It was a Grosjean right hand side into the wall, but yeah, haven't seen any footage.
A picture is worth 1,000 words, a common saying referring to the amount of detail and emotion that can be conveyed through a photo. Unfortunately, this one was worth the lives of 84 people. This still image is from a video of the 1955 24 Hours of Le Mans. To the far left is Jaguar driver Mike Hawthorne. In the middle is Austin Healey driver Lance Macklin. And soaring into the stands is Mercedes driver Pierre Levet. Mike Hawthorne had turned sharply in front of Lance Macklin in order to pit his vehicle. Lance Macklin would course correct around Hawthorne, clipping the front of Levet, sending the Mercedes into the grandstands directly towards onlookers. 83 people were killed, 84 were including the driver, and 120 more were injured. Since its first race, the Circuit de la Star de Le Mans has become ever-changing. And although an accident of this kind has not happened on the track since, the image of that day has forever stained the legacy of not only this track, but racing as a whole. Some would say a man wasn't meant to reach the once unheard-of speeds of the automobile, but with that speed comes a cost. In the 1950s, the top speed in a Formula One car was 180 miles per hour, set by Jack Brabham's T51. By the 1970s, Formula One's golden era, cars were easily moving over 200 miles an hour. But with the ever-rising speed of these cars, the price of defying nature had shown its head. Multiple drivers would die in the 1970s during Formula One meetings. In 1982, Riccardo Paletti would die in just his second start in Formula One. After his death, it would seem that racing has paid off its debts. And outside of Elio De Angelis's death during a test in 1986, no driver would die in Formula One. Formula One's top speed wouldn't rise much from the 80s to the 90s, but the overall lap times were decreasing rapidly, as the cars were able to perform at much higher speeds for longer and longer on the track. And no car would prove that more than the MP44. Powered by Honda's 1.5-liter V6 turbocharged engine, the MP44 became, at the time, the most dominant F1 car ever. Until another car powered by a Honda-made V6 would somehow be more dominant.
Max Verstappen, a three-time champion!
The MP44 would win every race, except one, and out of the 1,031 laps it ran in 1988, it led in 1,003 of them. Not only did McLaren have an extremely dominant car with them, they would also have two extremely talented drivers to pilot their MP44. Alain Prost and Ayrton Senna. The combination of these drivers in that car is legendary and is still talked about even today. But as it usually does with racing, this speed has a cost. Alain Prost would retire as a driver in 1993, leaving Ayrton Senna as the only active driver from that 88 season. By 1994, Ayrton Senna was no longer with McLaren and was now driving with Williams. The 1994 San Marino Grand Prix is one of the darkest F1 events ever held. Until that point, it had been almost 12 years since a driver had been killed during a race. Driver Roland Ratzenberger was killed during qualifying, and multiple other crashes had caused injuries to not only drivers, but also bystanders watching. And as dark as a weekend it had already been, the San Marino Grand Prix still had one last tragedy. The steering column on Ayrton Senna's FW16 snapped just before the Tamburello corner. Ayrton Senna would run off the track in the 7th lap, hitting concrete at almost 140 miles an hour. Ayrton Senna, dead at 34. After Senna's death, the FIA would begin implementing safety measures to keep a weekend like this from happening again. Formula One racing would become safer. It had seemed that motorsports and the inherent risks of defying nature had come to a crescendo that weekend. But even still, Senna would not be the last driver to be killed while racing in Formula One. Prior to his death, Ayrton Senna was already an icon, and his rivalry with his teammate Alain Prost became legendary. Senna was one of the most talented and esteemed drivers of not just his time, but of all time, making his death all the more shocking and heartbreaking. Even Senna, a driver already burned into the history books as one of the greatest to ever do it, wasn't safe from the brutal nature of motorsports, a mortal becoming immortalized in history. After the Black Weekend at San Marino in 1994, the FIA began working on safety measures including limiting pit lane speeds and helmet regulations. The FIA identified 27 corners in 1994 that they had decided required modifications. By 1996, only 2 of the said 27 remained. The FIA also regulated the cars themselves, requiring less downforce and therefore less speed. It's arguable whether these requirements actually made the sport safer. But what wasn't arguable was the head and neck support device, or otherwise called the Hans device. In 2003, the Hans device was implemented in F1. It's basically a collar that goes around your neck and slightly down your chest that restricts the excessive head movement drivers would often have when colliding with walls or other drivers. Over the next few years, the Hans device would be adapted into just about every form of motorsport. And not only the Hans device, but many other safety precautions began being implemented into motorsports. It had seemed that man was inching closer and closer to taming the machine. After the incident that killed Dale Earnhardt, arguably the greatest NASCAR driver ever, NASCAR would begin implementing multiple safety measures like the previously mentioned Hans device, safer barriers, and the car of tomorrow. And still to this day, Dale Earnhardt was the last death during a NASCAR race. WRC would do the same, and driver injuries and death would decline sharply in the 1990s. And even in F1, no driver would die during the Grand Prix after Senna's death in 1994. By 2014, Formula One was using localized yellow flags for single vehicle accidents. People weren't particularly fond of this due to the dangers of not neutralizing a race before bringing tractor equipment onto the gravel. This oversight by the FIA would open the door for nature to rebel against its nearly 20 years of being tamed. At the 2014 Japanese Grand Prix, Suzuka's circuit was soaked. Adrian Sutil, driver for Sauber, lost control rounding the Dunlop curve, spinning into the tire barriers. Immediately, marshals entered the track with a recovery vehicle also entering. Jules Bianchi would lose control of his car at the Dunlop curve in the same fashion of Sutil, but instead of spinning into the barrier, Bianchi would run directly into the underside of the crane on the gravel at almost 80 miles an hour. Even with the state-of-the-art helmet, he suffered severe head trauma, knocking him into an unconscious state that he would never recover from. As much as we talk about the brutal nature of motorsports, we can sometimes in Cassetone fashion just accept that this is the nature of the sport. The Hans device began seeing true implementation into motorsports in the 2000s. When was it invented? In the 1980s. If Dale Earnhardt had worn it, he would likely still be here today. The halo we see on all modern Formula One cars was made mandatory in 2018 and developed the year prior. Had it been on Bianchi or even Senna's car in 1994, they may also both still be here. Hindsight is always 20/20, and you can't point the blame at one person. But all that being said, we have made great strides towards safer motorsports. Before the 2000s, there was always a chance that your favorite driver may die that evening, and while that risk is still present today, it seems that we may have tamed the unpredictable nature of motorsports. Motorsports are inherently dangerous. People are very fragile, and putting them in big metal machines that move way faster than people were supposed to go isn't exactly the safest recreational activity. But also inherently, motorsports are beautiful. We do things that are dangerous. We naturally fight nature itself because of the great beauty of competition. Although motorsports has become safer, those who dare to step into the cockpit of their vehicles don't do it because they think it'll be safe and easy. It's because of the opposite. It's a love for something so dangerous, like when Steve Irwin would hang with crocodiles, or when Felix Baumgartner jumped from space back to Earth. We don't stop ourselves because nature thinks we can't. We try because we think we can, and I think that's beautiful. The safety of drivers in motorsports is never certain, but what is always certain is Max Verstappen winning the race.